All right, can we get a bit more noise this time around? Thank you for indulging me. All right, welcome. We are here to listen to Jason Donovan, who I'm going to give a quick bio about, and you can only get from me. Please ignore all the facts behind me, because that's where I'm getting them from. And then we'll get right into it. It will be a Q&A session, so if you see any red shirts, they're the ones with microphones. Just put your hand up. One of the four of us will come and get to you, and you can ask your questions. And just before we start, I would like to have a quick thank you for everyone who's volunteering this weekend at Expo. So we could just hear a round of applause for everyone who's making this run. I'm only doing this just to indulge my ego, so thank you very much. All right, so Jason Donovan, he's almost tenured at UFC, so that's almost pretty cool. Pretty soon it'll get there and it'll be really cool, but it's just almost right now. He, as a professor, he's a Department of Physics and Astronomy at UFC, and he teaches how people learn science, which I think is pretty cool. I have never thought about how people learn science, only that I don't want to learn science myself. He also does Intro to Physics and courses related to energy and nuclear power, and if you don't think that's fascinating, then we are on two different pages. Please welcome Jason Donovan.
Does anyone recognize anything up there? If you don't, you're probably in the wrong place. Okay. Anyone know this one? Okay, how about this one? Oh, it says right on there. How about this one? Seems familiar. Hero protagonist is standing there. That's Snow Crash, yeah. Everyone knows this one, right? Yeah. Ender's Game, original cover, yes. Anyone know this one? Oh yeah, it says right there, 20,000 Leagues. And of course, anybody know this one? This is my favorite science fiction author. He's my favorite science fiction author because he should be someone's favorite science fiction author, and I decided to take that on. That's Robert Sheckley. Can you feel anything when I do this? That particular this is a collection of short stories, and that particular short story is about a vacuum cleaner that falls in love with a young housewife. I don't want to give any spoilers beyond that. And this, anyone recognize that? This was a limited edition. It is Ringworld, yes. Ringworld by Larry Niven. Okay, so I'm a prof. We did this already. I'm also a geek. Are there any other geeks here? Yeah! Hopefully this talk will help you feel good about that. It makes me feel good about it. So I'm a science fiction fan. Any science fiction fans? Good. I'm also a popular science writer. Anybody heard of NPR? National Public Radio? I have written for NPR, The Lowdown on Science. I also write for Physics in Canada. My most recent article on how to use sundials on the internet got completely ignored, but I am also the mad scientist and consultant for Tyche Books, a Calgary-based fantasy and science fiction publishing house. We're in booth 210 here at the Expo. Come by and say hi if you'd like to chat a little bit about science fiction and fantasy after this. I'm also a father. I have a little geekling. Here's my bundle of joy. Oh, and that's my daughter. This is a can-do fuel bundle. This is what we stick in nuclear reactors. It's empty. I lost this game. Best guinea pig playing chess in the world. Only guinea pig that plays chess. Yeah, so I'm big on geek. And I want to talk about how science fiction influences science and technology. And of course, as a scientist, the big difficulty is there's no control group. There is no group that has science that doesn't have science fiction, or has science fiction that doesn't have science. In the great divide between the communist countries and the free countries, or however you want to divide it up, the East versus West, Both sides, while they were doing their rapid scientific advances, wound up developing their own science fiction. And it's interesting, and beyond the scope of this talk, to look at how the Soviet science fiction was fundamentally different from the science fiction of, say, Canada and the US and so forth. But science fiction has inspired many technologies and science. It's also predicted. Sometimes it's gotten lucky. Sometimes it predicted in a very intelligent way. And it's also influenced our view of technology, science, and scientists. And we'll talk a fair amount about that as well. Okay? So, how many people here like Star Wars? Woo! Good. How many people like Star Trek? Okay, we'll talk about Star Trek first, because that was more enthusiastic. Anybody know what the name of this aircraft carrier is? Very good. I'm not even going to ask. So, Star Trek. Last year, they asked me to put together this talk because they had a couple people from Star Trek showing up. Yay, it was fun. And they said, can you do an hour on the science of Star Trek? And I said, no, I can do 3 minutes on the science of Star Trek. Because there will be Trekkies there who know more about Star Trek than I do, and they will rip me limb from limb. So here's the 3 minutes. Star Trek is responsible for flip phones, tablets, and tricorders. And a friend of mine who actually does work for the US Men in Black, will just, I think that's all I'm allowed to know about what she does, says that every time her bosses come to her, they say, what we really want is a tricorder. So they don't even know that what they really want is a tricorder, but they have this vague recollection of being able to hold something up to someone and going, yes, I know you're carrying a bomb, or I know what you're thinking. So science fiction, it's a subtle effect. So the biggest thing, though, with Star Trek is Star Trek inspired an entire generation of young geeks. So much so that James Doohan, who is Scotty, yeah, got an honorary PhD from the Milwaukee School of Engineering. Why? Because so many people coming into the Milwaukee School of Engineering was like, Star Trek, that's how I got started in engineering. James Doohan found out about this and he went, what? We're not doing engineering there at all. But Star Trek, and by extension Star Wars, has become the Shakespeare of engineering and science. What do I mean by that? Anybody ever had an English teacher in high school say, you need to read Shakespeare because all educated people know Shakespeare? Anybody ever been told that? And I'm not contesting the point. I actually think Shakespeare is awesome. Sorry if that's an unpopular view here. Woohoo! Yes. But how many people would trust an engineer who didn't know who Scotty was? I mean, like, seriously, would you want to fly in a plane that was designed by somebody who had no opinion on Kirk versus Spock? Like, I wouldn't want to get in that plane. Why? Because engineers need to know their Star Trek. Scientists need to know their Star Trek. We need to know our Star Wars. And before we get too far, we also need to know our Monty Python. which I'm fine with. Like, I'm totally fine with that. You know, I'm a geek. I have a little sticker that I got from the vendor's room that says so. Okay? So there was an entire documentary which showed William Shatner's acting ability at its finest, called How William Shatner Changed the World, which is based on a book that William Shatner wrote called I'm Working on That. I have watched the documentary, so you don't have to. Here's what you get out of an hour and a half of watching Kirk act. They made flip phones, they made tablets and tricorders. Everything else was actually somebody else first. So, this isn't just uniquely my interest. The American Association of Physicists conducted a survey a number of years ago trying to figure out what percentage of people were inspired to go into physics originally because of science fiction. And unfortunately, the answer was only 15%. I think this is a fib because every physics club, room, hangout I've ever seen in the 9 different universities I've been affiliated with has always, always, always had a room full of people who could identify a significant fraction of that first slide, just as you could. Yeah? Sure. No, it could be that way. So let's talk about some really early predictions back before we even were calling it science fiction, Scifi, speculative fiction, or whatever Margaret Atwood has decided we're allowed to refer to it as here in Canada. Grrr. Sorry. Anyway, Jonathan Swift predicted in Gulliver's Travels that there would be 2 moons of Mars. Did he use some mystical science? No, he got lucky. If you look at all the things that have been written and just do some probability, they're going to get it right sometimes. There will be amazing coincidences sometimes. What's a little bizarre, though, in Micromegas, 26 years later, Voltaire said the same thing. And as a result, both of them get craters named after them on Mars. By the way, the 2 moons are known as Phobos, which is fear, and Deimos, which is panic. Moving forward quite a bit, we have Tom Swift and his electric rifle. TSER. Huh. Sounds like we could almost turn that into an acronym like TASER. So tasers go back to Tom Swift, a child's science fiction story by Victor Appleton. I read Tom Swift as a child, really enjoyed Tom Swift as a child, because hey, they're talking about science in a really cool way. I'm part of that 15%. But it turns out that you have to go back to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where these Leyden jars, so what you do is you take a piece of tin foil, you stick it into a jar, and you hook it up to a piece of metal, and then you use a Van de Graaff generator to put like 100,000 volts on it. And then you can kill people with it. We have these around the department. I've now just told you how to make them. So, fortunately, how many people have a Van de Graaff generator? Oh, damn. The FBI told me to stop doing that. So Jules Verne created an awful lot, but it pales in comparison to what H.G. Wells did. In A Story of Days to Come, which was a short story, and then in the same universe, When the Sleeper Wakes, which was 2 years later, which was eventually novelized. The 2 were novelized into The Sleeper Wakes, which came out in 1910. This is the first time we have this extensive of an idea of science fiction in a novel, and really sitting down and trying to predict the intricacies of a future world. This is the first time we have this level of intricate world building that has come to the sort of thing that we have known and loved for a while and come to Comic Expo to celebrate. So he predicts moving sidewalks, which later became a very central piece of Robert Heinlein's short story, Anyone Know? The roads must roll. So science fiction just borrows from itself entirely. Science fiction is, to a certain extent, an almost standalone pile of literature that is engaged in a conversation in amongst itself. So Heinlein was actually referring to some of the political ideas from The Sleeper Wakes, but you need to read both of them in order to understand that interplay. This isn't really invented by H.G. Wells, because H.G. Wells probably saw it at the Chicago Expo 15 years earlier. Mechanical surface digitizers. You walk into a store, you measure a suit, or rather, you put on this big hulking metal thing that measures you, and then it makes a suit from that. We now have these at my work. Not for suits, but it's actually used for manufacturing little tiny pieces, and the vendor's room also has one. If you want to get a little TARDIS keychain or something, they've got a 3D printer, which was predicted back in 1910. He also created DVD players, moving pictures, and VCRs, sort of. Automated sliding doors. Probably came from the idea of roll-top desks. Invented in 1954 in Corpus Christi because it's so windy there, they couldn't use normal doors. But the electric garage doors actually go back to 1926. I was really surprised to learn that when researching this talk. But H.G. Wells predicted it first. Far more interesting, H.G. Wells, in 1914, before World War I, predicts the atomic bomb that winds up setting the world free, so to speak, at the end of World War II. He predicts sustained atomic reactions, radioactive ruins, and even names the atomic bomb. This is one of the freakiest, for me, predictions of the future by how accurate H.G. Wells was able to get. It turns out, though, that Robert Cromie, in Crack of Doom, predicted it back in 1895. Not as thoroughly. So let's start talking a little bit about influence and how science fiction has influenced our culture. War of the Worlds. Has anybody actually read War of the Worlds? Wow, great. So it's the first serious alien invasion story. And of course, it's not really about aliens from Mars. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It's really about British colonialism. It's really about, oh my God, what would it be like if somebody with an incredibly advanced technology came to our country and took things over with technology we not only couldn't imagine, but can't possibly understand. Of course, this has turned into almost all science fiction being a xenophobia-based approach. So they've got the heat ray, which is a collimated light source which can shoot out. I think I've got one. How's that for meta? And it also inspired a rock opera, which went platinum, and video games in 1984, 1998, 1999, 2011. So it's become very much a part of our culture. But he also goes on to predict wrist communicators. I'm sorry to say Star Trek didn't get it first. It didn't. He also predicted, strangely enough, World War II. He predicted that it would start with Germany and Poland, that it would involve Japan, siding with Germany and Poland, and he predicts this in 1933. Really quite a prescient guy. It's also interesting that Dick Tracy didn't get his wrist communicator, although Dick Tracy did exist at this point, he didn't get his wrist communicator until 1946. How else has this influenced us? Well, the island of Dr. Moreau. The existence of a cell particle. That controls living organism. Why a rat grows like a rat. A bird grows like a bird. This thing, this cell that determines the shape of life. Is that life? So we have our first reaction to genetically modified crops. Back with the island of Dr. Moreau. And of course, science fiction has carried forward with that. Anybody seen Jurassic Park? Anybody bothered by the science in Jurassic Park? Good. It doesn't work. DNA is not that stable of a molecule to last for 65 million years in the stomach of a bug encased in amber. We will not get dinosaurs back, which is kind of funny given how much effort they put into making the rest of the science plausible. All the dinosaur stuff was actually really quite on top of things, but the DNA stuff was, well, pretty much on a par with what Michael Crichton normally turns out. We'll talk more about that later. More interesting, though, this idea of the cell of life. The Golden Helix, written by Theodore Sturgeon. Theodore Sturgeon, for those of you who like science fiction, this is the guy that Stephen King read as a kid. This is the guy that Robert Heinlein loved to read. This is the guy that Spider Robinson. This is the science fiction author that all the science fiction authors read. They have re-released all of his shorts. He is the master of his short. His novels are okay too, but his short fiction is just superb. You want to go back to the original source material, read Ted Sturgeon. Anyway, 1953, Ted Sturgeon tosses out a book called The Golden Helix, which describes an alien creature in the shape of a huge helix that comes around and steals biological information and stores it. The same year, 3 months earlier, Watson and Crick wind up working out the double helical structure of DNA. Coincidence? Yes. In this particular edition, which is the one I have, Theodore Sturgeon writes an essay about, look, I'm a science fiction writer. Of course I'm going to get it right from time to time, just by random chance. On the other extreme, we have people like Anson MacDonald. Anybody know who Anson MacDonald is? It's a pen name. So this guy was writing so much that the various magazines like Astounding were like, look, we need to have different names on our cover. How about we take your middle name and your mother's maiden name? And Robert Heinlein wound up publishing under Anson MacDonald. This particular story, Waldo, was about a crippled genius living in space. He couldn't stand Earth gravity. So he wound up developing telefactoring devices, which are huge robot arms that could manipulate things in environments that people couldn't do. couldn't work in. We now actually call these telefactoring devices Waldos. Where's Waldo? Well, it turned out that it was originally in Astounding Science Fiction, August of 1942. So if anybody ever asks you where's Waldo, you can now answer the question. I know, different Waldo. Also from Robert Heinlein, Coventry, July 1940, first describes hot air dryers like we have in bathrooms. Time Enough for Love, artificial gravity-assisted childbirth. This is 1973. So let me describe this for you for a moment. You have a pedal. So a woman is in labor, and right as she's supposed to bear down, whoever's helping her with the labor pushes down on the pedal and artificially makes gravity turn up, helping pull the child out. In 1977, somebody thought this was such a good idea, George Blonsky and Charlotte Blonsky actually put in a patent for a huge centrifuge that straps a woman down to the table, and whenever she's bearing down, you press a pedal, and it speeds the whole thing up. Sometimes science fiction inspires really bad engineering. I can't believe I actually found a picture of this. Aerobraking. Here's an artist's rendition of a Mars mission from 1991 where they're using aerobraking, using the atmosphere of a planet to slow down the relative velocity between the spaceship and the planet in question. Where does it go back to? Well, of course, it goes back to Space Cadet. First comes out in 1948, a children's novel, once again by Robert Heinlein. The strangest one, however, for me, by far, is that Robert Heinlein in 1961 predicts screensavers. He even predicts that the screensavers will look like fish. Okay? Stranger in a Strange Land. And if that was the most important thing you got out of Stranger in a Strange Land, you didn't read the same book I did. Isaac Asimov, in Foundation, 1942 to 1950, predicts calculators. Anybody a fan of reverse Polish? Yes! Okay. Yes, they now have an emulator for the RP on the iPad, which was also predicted in Isaac Asimov's Foundation. I hadn't realized that has anybody read Foundation? How many people realized it was originally a magazine serial? I didn't until I was putting this talk together. So it first got published in 1950 as a unit, but its original publication goes back to 1942. When I last gave this talk down in Lethbridge a week and a half ago, somebody corrected me and said, Foundation is not the first place where there's calculators. Isaac Asimov talked about it in A Feeling of Power, or The Feeling of Power, depending on what the source says, which first came out in 1958. So this story, has anybody read this story? Good. This is a wonderful piece of science fiction, both from the standpoint of our ideas about science fiction and our ideas towards technology, and it's just a great piece of writing. What it talks about is this idea that we will become so dependent on machines we will no longer be able to multiply. And the premise, and I will do spoilers on this one, sorry, the premise is that Schumann teaches himself to multiply. It takes him about a year, and he works by writing it out on cards, and he learns how to multiply. And he's the first person in hundreds of years who's learned any math at all. And everyone else is so impressed that they create a program where they're training people to learn how to do mathematical operations so they can stick people on bombs because they're cheaper than computers. And it closes with 9 times 7, thought Schumann with deep satisfactory, is 63. And I don't need a computer to tell me that. The computer is in my own head. And it was amazing, the feeling of power it gave them. How many people can actually still do their times tables? Good. I shudder the first time I do this talk and nobody raises their hand. In Foundation and Empire, the second Foundation book, he predicts walnut-sized nuclear power plants, which we're now actually using for the Curiosity Mars rover. Plutonium-238 is being used to run, so we actually just shipped a nuclear power plant to Mars. We're not allowed to build them in Canada, but we can ship them to Mars. By the way, there is a plutonium shortage coming soon. We don't have enough plutonium for all the space missions. I was really, really perplexed by this fact that there's this plutonium shortage. Okay. Pardon? They did restart production, but I don't think they're going to be able to keep up with the demand. It is my opinion. But anyway, book 3, second foundation, in 1953 predicts what I used to get here today, an automatic ticket machine. It's unclear how far back these go. But anyways, the most interesting part of this is people have read Foundation, right? Psychohistory? Okay, so the basic premise of psychohistory is this guy, whose name is Harry Seldon, uses math to predict 1,000 years of future. Okay? Statistical interpretation of human behavior, the larger the population size, the more accurate your predictions can be. And of course, anybody recognize this map? Any Americans? So Nate Silver used baseball statistics to predict the last 2 presidential elections. He got 99 out of 100 states correct. He was wrong about Indiana in 2008. Right, he got a senator wrong as well. I was just talking about the presidential. Pardon me, yes, he didn't predict the senatorial races as accurately as he was hoping as well. I would argue that Nate Silver has, however, come up with a way of doing psychohistory. This is psychohistory. He's using math to predict the future. So I would say, keep calm and trust Harry Seldon. Keep calm, trust Nate Silver. One way or the other. Whatever you like. Okay? So we're doing this. And I would argue that psychohistory was probably the least probable thing to come true from science fiction of anything that I've read. If you have something less probable, let me know after the talk. When putting together this talk, all my colleagues were fond of saying, oh, geosynchronous satellites, those were invented by Arthur C. Clarke. Except they weren't. They were actually invented by Herman Potocznik. But here's the interesting thing about geekdom. Geekdom and science has been closely intertwined for a long, long time. And in science wonder stories, scientists would have an opportunity to speculate about various possible technologies. So this scientist wrote an article about geosynchronous satellites and how useful they would be for worldwide radio coverage, sort of like what we have with cell phones now. First one was launched in 1961. The article was first put out in 1941. Clarke wrote about this, but originally he was writing as a science fiction author, writing about science. So by way of comparison, here we have Sputnik going around the Earth. Strangely, space is fairly close. If you could drive your car straight up, you'd be at space inside of an hour. Space is closer than Red Deer. Yeah, kind of scary, isn't it? Which would you rather visit? I mean, anyway. With proper equipment. Okay. So Sputnik is actually 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Sputnik is the same distance away as Edmonton. I'd much rather go to Edmonton. Okay. So here is what a geosynchronous satellite would look like. 7 Earth radii away from the center. Okay. So normal satellites, geosynchronous satellites. Very few satellites are geosynchronous. It's more expensive to get them up there. By way of comparison, here we have the moon's orbit, and here we have the geosynchronous orbit, and here we have the recent asteroid last year. Everybody remember that asteroid that almost missed us? Okay. Much cooler than this, though, for me, is the space elevator. So this idea, presented by Konstantin Tchaikovsky, you can read it, in 1895 after seeing the Eiffel Tower. This person wound up being a consultant for the film Kosmicheski Ruiz in 1936. The Russians really did their sci-fi right in a lot of ways. They would bring in scientists and say, no, 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 there's no explosions in space. So when the Death Star goes boom, you don't actually hear anything. Okay? I like Russian science fiction for that. Arthur C. Clarke winds up writing about this in Foundations of Paradise, and even predicts that carbon nanotubes specifically will be used for the space elevator before carbon nanotubes are even found in the lab. They're currently investigating whether or not carbon nanotubes can be made to stretch the 7 Earth radii up to the geosynchronous satellite that would then allow for this. He also produces Google Alerts and molecular sieves, where you actually have a molecule go through the ocean and pick out useful things like gold in The Man Who Plowed the Seas. Personal Interest Profile, which is basically Google Alerts, started also in Fountains of Paradise. Moving over to computers, we have always had thinking machines. Cadmus was sewing dragon's teeth as a way of creating robots and automaton-type creatures. Pygmalion and Galatia. Hephaestus, the blacksmith of gods, created metal mechanical figures. So metal robots go back to the ancient Greeks. Now, knowledge engines go back to Gulliver's Travels in the early 18th century. Now, this is, I think, probably the funniest instance of science fiction getting it backwards. You have a machine that can write sentences mechanically. You have gears and cogs and so forth that allows it to put together words and sentences. But then you have a room full of scribes who have to handwrite everything, as opposed to just coming up with printers. There was an automaton chess player and Robot RUR by Čapek in 1912, which is where we get the word robot from. But the best one, by far, is a short story by Murray Leinster called A Logic Named Joe. He predicts interconnected home computers, the Carson circuit, which is a worldwide connection of computers, tanks, which are computer screens and hard drives, message service, which is email, location service, helps you find people, Facebook, and then tells you about them, also Facebook or LinkedIn if you prefer. Stock prices, he predicts day trading of stocks, and he says there's an entire encyclopedia that people who are experts can simply log in and make changes to. Basically Wikipedia. Computerized phone calls, Skype, and of course you can watch shows on these things. In 1946, he does all this in 2 paragraphs. He's just setting up his world. Why? This guy's ex-wife winds up tracking him down through the Facebook type thing, and that's the story that's supposed to happen, which is now happening. Cyberpunk. William Gibson, cyberspace, Birmingham Chrome, the Neuromancer, web conferences, Idoru. Neil Stephenson did not originally come up with the idea of avatars. He didn't. He should have, but he didn't. Somebody beat him to it, but he sort of perfected the idea of avatars. Then we have Google Earth, and during the dot-com boom, people would get hired and be handed a copy of Snow Crash and say, this is our business plan, this science fiction novel. So the people at Google Earth looked at the CIC Virtual Earth and said, yeah, we could do that, and that's where Google Earth comes from. And of course, Second Life, same basic thing with Lincoln Labs. So turn to your neighbor and discuss which of the following are science fiction. I like that answer. Which of them aren't? Yeah, exactly. They all are. Could House MD, is that actually realistic? No. Or how about CSI? We're going to do a Fourier transform on this poorly... Oh, God. Yeah. I have a friend who's a forensic scientist, and he finds that as amusing to watch as... Anyway. So, how many fictional scientists can you name? How many fictional scientists can you name? No one's come up with that. Okay. So, which ones of the ones you've come up with are villains? Yeah. That's okay. I've got Doc Brown on the next slide. How many of these scientists, the good guy scientists, are clueless and socially inept? Crazy, innocently to blame for what's going on, or only coincidentally scientists? Or old and senile. Oh, I should include that. Now, is this painting science in a good light? No. So, Robert Cromie wrote in Crack of Doom, where the atomic bomb is first predicted, "There are no limits," Brandy said decisively. "No man can say to science, thus far and no farther. No man has ever been able to do, no man ever shall." So our myths shape our lives. Scientists have become to blame for what's going on through our media. And I'm not talking about news, although that's the case too. But in our popular media, scientists have become to blame for whatever's going on. Now, science gets under political scrutiny. And politicians who don't understand science, we have a chiropractor in charge of science at the national level. He's the MP in charge of science. Yeah, and there's a creationist. No, it's abounding. Okay, so action for you, read this book, The Science of Fear. It talks about how our myths, our perceptions are being shaped by what we fear and how inaccurate what we fear really is. Okay? Science of Fear. Daniel Gardner, he's a Canadian journalist. Big take-home message is, gut makes snap decisions. Oh my God, there's a lion there, run. Oh wait, it's a rock. Head makes small changes to gut's reactions, but the decisions are made by the gut and then justified by the head. I just didn't like it. I'm uncomfortable. But the reason I'm uncomfortable is because the engineer just didn't know enough about Star Trek. Gut makes decisions, head compensates for it. Okay? So then we have confirmation bias, where we ignore contrary information. I have made up my mind about fluoride in the water. I'm going to ignore all information that disagrees with me. So we read stories that confirm our perceptions, and then we have herd rule. So if we get a bunch of people together who all believe more or less the same thing, everybody winds up walking out believing more intently. So, for example, if I think Star Wars is really cool, and on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm at about a 5, and I get together with a whole bunch of people who believe Star Wars is really cool, all at about a 5, we will walk out all believing Star Wars is really cool at about a 7 or 8. Because there's a herd bias that says, oh yeah, me too. Okay? Now, a quick survey. Which is more harmful? Radiation from nature or radiation from man-made activities? There's no difference. Now, in terms of the amounts, yes, there's more radiation from nature. So if I will accept your answer as well, yes. Operation Uranium. It was terror disguised as a woman. What? Canadian Mounties versus Atomic Invaders. You can watch the trailer for this on YouTube. I haven't been able to track down the actual movie, but the trailer, wow, I thought Plan 9 from Outer Space was bad. Now, this hasn't really affected anything, right? There's no actual consequences for this, right? This isn't really affecting anything at all, right? The China Syndrome, a movie about a nuclear power plant going wrong in some scientifically impossible ways, and of course, the glowing mass of the meltdown is going to go through straight to China. Setting aside the physics for a moment, is China on the other side of the globe from the US? Anyway, this came out the same week as the 3 Mile Island accident happened. The same week. This is not the worst disaster in nuclear history by a long shot. It is the most interesting coincidence, but it is not the worst disaster. 2 people died as a result of the 3 Mile Island accident. And what did they die from? They heard an announcement on the radio saying, there's a problem with the nuclear power plant. And they had a heart attack and died. Seriously. I wouldn't joke about that. I mean, it's funny in a horrible sort of way, but it's really tragic that our perceptions of science have gotten things that far out of control. I saw the same thing happen with the Fukushima accident. I got contacted, and it's like, should we be taking potassium iodine pills? No. Well, why not? Why would you? The half-life of everything coming out of Fukushima, which was a negligible, no, well, not negligible, but a relatively small compared to the amount of radiation released, would have all decayed by the time it got across the Pacific Ocean. And the potassium iodine pills that people in Vancouver were popping like they were candy, amusingly, are also radioactive because of the potassium, because potassium's radioactive. But radiation in movies, on the other hand, he wasn't even irradiated. He was bitten by an irradiated spider. It wasn't even a radioactive spider. It's so removed. Anyway, our myths include you don't know that. Science can do anything. And we don't really know anything. A lone scientist will prove it wrong soon anyhow. And Michael Crichton, who is a medical doctor, not a scientist. Pardon me, yes, was. I need to be careful when I speak ill of the dead. He knows nothing about nanotechnology. Nothing. And that's really, really evident if you know anything about nanotechnology and read Prey. He knows even less about climate and uses this state of fear to sort of propagate a state of fear. But science can do anything? It's really unlikely that anybody know what year this was supposed to come from? Wasn't it 2015? Yeah, this is the state of our technology. We could build a robot that could go up and bruise Sarah Connor's ankles. Now the fiction is a lone scientist is, working alone, changes the world, and then the world goes back to the way it was. The reality is huge teams of collaborative scientists. Science is a social activity conducted by antisocial people. And then the world stays changed. We cannot put it back in. Okay? So the last idea I want to present to you is a group of 7th graders were asked before going to Fermilabs to draw a scientist. And you can actually just Google Fermilab 7th grade scientists. Is people can change. And this is what the same 7th grader drew after touring Fermilabs. Before, after. Of the 20 some odd students who drew pictures of scientists, only one drew a woman, and that's what she looked like. At the end of the day, that's what she looked like. You start off with this, and after actually getting to know some scientists, you're going to draw something like this. We're happy people. We're people. We're geeky people. But we're still people. So, stories create our myths. Myths shape our perceptions. Science fiction has had a huge impact on people's perception of science, both good and bad. Geeks need to help out those poor non-geeks. How many people help other people with their computer problems? Right. Help them with understand the intricate science of climate change. The media is not going to help. Let's keep enjoying our science fiction. If you want to take a quick picture of this with your phones, this is where I got most of the ideas from. This is the rebuttal to Michael Crichton's State of Fear, and there's also a wonderful article in National Geographic about this. So I will close. My wife and I